Good afternoon and welcome to our program titled What You Need to Know About Consumer Complaints and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, presented by Venable and Deloitte Financial Advisory Services. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Allison Baker and I will be one of the two moderators for the presentation this afternoon. I'm a partner here at Venable, and before I joined Venable I was an enforcement attorney in the Office of Enforcement at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Hello, my name is Dennis Kiefer. I'm a director at Deloitte Financial Advisory Services based here in Washington, D.C. I have more than 25 years of experience providing litigation support and financial advisory consulting services, as well as forensic investigations to financial institutions and their legal counsel, particularly in a regulatory context. Please note that this event is being recorded, and should you wish to not participate, you should disconnect from the call now. Also, due to the high volume of participants, the call will be muted throughout the webinar. Please use the online chat function to pose any questions you may have to us, and we'll answer your questions at the end of our presentation. So our agenda today is to go over the topics on the screen in front of you. We'd like to talk a bit about the consumer complaint database and the consumer complaint process. Next, we'll talk about how the CFPB uses complaints, a very important part of their function. Then I will present to you some observations about the complaint database that's been made public and what we can learn from that data. And lastly, we'll talk about some leading practices for complaint management.
An overview of the complaint database. The complaint database that the CFPB maintains is housed in the CFPB's Consumer Response Unit. And the Consumer Response Unit is the unit at the CFPB that is responsible for maintaining, collecting, gathering, analyzing, and addressing the consumer complaints that the CFPB takes in accordance with its statutory mandate. In fact, the Dodd-Frank Act required that upon its creation, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau create a method for collecting and tracking complaints, and that these complaints, the gathering of these complaints, be provided to Congress in an annual report, as well as shared with various law enforcement agencies, including state attorneys general, and coordinated with the Federal Trade Commission as appropriate. The CFPB provides for its complaint intake process over the internet. And so if you go to cfpb.gov, you can see that there's actually a part of the website that allows for consumers to provide the CFPB with information in the format of a complaint. And in order to provide the CFPB with this information, a consumer has to fill out an electronic form. The consumer is also provided with an opportunity to attach to that form various documents that might be the predicates for the underlying complaint. Another interesting component of the CFPB's complaint database is what's called Tell Your Story. And Tell Your Story, if you go on the CFPB's website, you will see there's a part of it under the consumer complaint section that has a Tell Your Story component. And this is essentially a box that a consumer can fill out that's not necessarily a complaint, if you will, about a particular product or service, but rather a story or an example of an event or an occurrence, could be good, could be bad, that has to do with a consumer's experience with a particular product. And the Tell Your Story component is a unique one because it's really more of a narrative for a consumer to provide input to the CFPB. And the CFPB does in fact read the Tell Your Story narratives and often gleans from those narratives information about the way a particular product or service may be functioning in the marketplace. Now the Consumer Response Unit, which houses the consumer database, the consumer complaint database, has a few functions at the CFPB. One of the functions is obviously to respond to complaints. Companies generally get 15 days to respond to a consumer complaint that's submitted through the CFPB's website. That response is usually provided to the consumer and also to the CFPB. And generally, companies have about 60 days to resolve most of the complaints that consumers make through the internet portal that the CFPB provides. So that's one of the functions of the Consumer Response Unit. Another function of the Consumer Response Unit is that it interfaces with the other parts of the CFPB and provides the other offices at the CFPB with information about the nature of the consumer complaints that are coming in through the internet complaint process. And so this might involve the Consumer Response Unit interfacing with the Office of Supervision or Enforcement, or perhaps providing markets or research to other offices of the CFPB with information about certain kinds of trends that are being observed through the intake process. Finally, the Consumer Response Unit from time to time will also have a kind of a quasi-investigative function where it looks at groupings of complaints and endeavors to understand a particular trend and maybe to learn more about a particular practice that's being complained about in order to better understand how prevalent it is and if that particular practice warrants additional CFPB efforts, either in the supervision context or the enforcement context or some other situation as that. So that's an overview of the complaint database as it's housed at the Consumer Response Unit at the CFPB.
So the CFPB started accepting complaints in July of 2011, and in November 2011 first made public the data that it was collecting. Throughout this presentation, we'll be talking about data in the database. Keep in mind that we have access to the public portion of that database. CFPB releases selected portions of the data to the public, and that data is released every single night. It's updated and refreshed every night, including complaints in process. But the chart in front of you shows the growth of that complaint database over time as the CFPB started adding new products, starting out with credit cards and mortgages, later on bank accounts, consumer loans, and student loans, not shown on the graph, but in later of 2012, credit reporting, and more recently money transfers, and most recently debt collection practices. The complaint database in 2012 was growing roughly 6,000 complaints a month, so it's been getting ever increasing. And more recently, with the new products that have been added and growing consumer awareness, the database is now getting about 9,000 complaints a month. And so currently, we're up to over 160,000 complaints in the database. Now, the complaint process, as Allison mentioned, there is an internet ability to supply your complaint, and roughly half of the complaints to date have come through the internet. About 30% of them have actually come to the CFPB through a different mechanism, referral, primarily by other regulatory agencies as well as other congressmen who might want to forward a complaint on, or other sources. And the rest, the 20% that remains, there's an ability to use mail, phone, email, and fax, and so on to send in complaints. Once a complaint is received by the CFPB, they review it for completeness, jurisdiction, and non-duplication. And they do not judge the merits of the complaint, but they send it on then to the financial institution for review and resolution. And as Allison mentioned, companies are supposed to respond generally within 15 days and generally resolve a complaint, all but the most complex ones anyway, within about 60 days. Complaints can either be resolved in favor of the client to the customer, and that can involve either monetary or non-monetary relief, or not in favor, perhaps with an explanation as to why it was not resolved in favor. And the consumer has the right to dispute the resolution of the complaint. And we'll talk a little bit later about that dispute rate and the dispute process. Then the CFPB shares complaint data with the state and federal law enforcement. It also analyzes data and periodically reports that data out in reports to Congress and to the public, as well as making the data available on its database.
The CFPB has specific uses for the consumer complaints that are received from the complaint database. And this afternoon I want to talk about a couple of those uses, if you will. One having to do with the CFPB's supervision process, its ability to examine banks and non-bank institutions, and two, having to do with the enforcement process, the ability of the CFPB to take enforcement action against any of the entities that it has oversight over. So the first component of this has to do with the CFPB's supervisory process, and this is somewhat multi-tiered. The CFPB's examination process uses complaints in a number of ways, consumer complaints in a number of ways. First, that process at the outset might look at particular consumer complaints in order to engage in a kind of scoping exercise, if you will, to determine the scope of a particular exam. So the CFPB might spend some time looking at consumer complaints that have come in through the consumer complaint database to understand if a particular practice is at issue in the institution it's about to examine, and if so, the number of complaints that the institution is receiving about its practice via the CFPB, and the extent of the practice, the scope of the practice, perhaps its egregiousness if that's an issue. And the complaints form some of the CFPB's understanding of how to scope that examination. It's definitely part of that process. To this end, as I said, the CFPB will look at the consumer complaint database that the CFPB houses. The CFPB also, though, has access to the Consumer Sentinel database, which is a database maintained by the Federal Trade Commission that is comprised of consumer complaints received by the Federal Trade Commission, by Better Business Bureaus throughout the United States, and by state attorneys general as well. And so the CFPB, as part of the law enforcement community that has access to that database, will also look at that database and cross-reference it with its own to understand better the nature of potential complaints that a particular institution might be receiving about one or more practices, in an effort to understand how the CFPB might consider approaching an examination of that institution. And again, the CFPB will look at both the number of particular complaints as well as the nature of the complaints and what it's seeing in terms of trends and numbers from consumers. Now, the CFPB's actual examination process also mandates that the Bureau, when it examines a bank or a non-bank over which it has supervisory authority, that it consider the manner in which that institution handles consumer complaints. And in fact, if you look at the CFPB's examination manual, supervisory examination manual, there's a whole module on compliance management, and specifically the way that a particular institution manages consumer complaints and the way it responds to those complaints. For example, when it examines an institution, the CFPB will look at whether or not that institution has a process for its intake of complaints, how it receives complaints, and how it categorizes the complaints it receives in order for those complaints to be responded to in an appropriate and timely manner. In addition, the CFPB's examination process will require that the company being examined have some process for addressing complaints, and specifically the escalation of those complaints. So if they are of a nature that require perhaps more immediate response, or the alleged conduct is egregious perhaps, or more egregious than what is typical, then the CFPB will be interested in looking at how a company uses its own internal processes to address those complaints and appropriately escalate them as needed. In addition, the CFPB's examination protocol requires that a company have a method for responding to the complaints and making any necessary changes or revisiting any practices that are at issue. And these are all parts of the CFPB's compliance management review when it undertakes an examination of a bank or non-bank over which it has supervisory authority. And another aspect of this that the CFPB's template module in its examination manual has is it also looks at, the CFPB also considers the relative level of management involved in determining the nature and categories of complaints and the way that those complaints are ultimately handled. When those complaints are escalated, are they escalated to what level of management, and what level of management in a company has knowledge of the complaints and also the process for resolving those complaints. And so the supervision, the Office of Supervision at the CFPB really uses complaints in kind of two basic ways. Number one, to help scope and understand better the nature of an exam it's about to undertake. And number two, once it's examining a particular bank or non-bank, to understand how that bank or non-bank has compliance management systems in place that address and receive and address consumer complaints. And so those are two basic ways that the CFPB's Office of Supervision looks at and uses consumer complaints. But I also want to talk a little bit about the way the Office of Enforcement uses consumer complaints. And the reason I focused on the Offices of Supervision and Enforcement is because those are two offices that interface in many ways. They are kind of the offices that interface with industry and with regulated entities the most. And they're offices that have very specific uses for consumer complaints and are very interested in understanding better what kinds of complaints are being made about what kinds of practices as to what institutions. And so all of this is very important when a company is looking at how it ought to be responding to potential CFPB examination, or in the case of the enforcement context, a potential investigation. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the way the Office of Enforcement also uses and looks at consumer complaints. And the first way it does this is it looks at consumer complaints in the context of an investigation. So the Office of Enforcement might take some time to look at consumer complaints received from consumer response even before it propounds a civil investigative demand or determines whether or not it's going to investigate a company's particular practice. Consumer complaints, the number of those complaints, the nature of those complaints, the scope of them, the length of time that complaints span, all of these factors might make a determination or might help the Office of Enforcement make a determination about whether to initiate an investigation. And once it does make a determination, for example, that it seeks to obtain more information in the context of an investigation, the nature of complaints, the number of complaints, might drive the scope of a civil investigative demand. The way that a civil investigative demand is phrased, the kinds of information, documents, even testimony that a CID seeks in connection with an investigation, which might be reflective of the nature of complaints that are coming in through the consumer complaint database. Not always, but sometimes. Now, that's the investigative phase of the CFPB's Office of Enforcement's conduct, but the CFPB's Office of Enforcement, of course, also has litigation authority. And one thing we haven't seen a lot of yet, because there hasn't really been a lot of litigation with the Bureau, is how the CFPB could use or will use consumer complaints in the actual litigating of matters. But I think it's fair to say that there are at least three different ways that consumer complaints are likely to be used. The first is the nature and scope of consumer complaints actually driving or helping make a determination about the cause of action that the Office of Enforcement might bring in a litigation. For example, if there's a prevalence of certain kinds of complaints, the CFPB's Office of Enforcement might be inclined to say, well, based on our investigation and based on the prevalence of complaints as to practice X, we think that it's fair to call this kind of practice deceptive, and we're going to bring a deceptive cause of action. That's one scenario that I could see happening at some point. Another situation where you might see consumer complaints being used in the litigation context is when you actually have complainants, folks who brought these complaints, who made these complaints, interviewed by the CFPB to the extent that that's a possibility, or otherwise having these complaints used in some way to prove the existence of a practice or to help prove the existence of a practice. And similarly, you could see a scenario where some of those consumers, to the extent that they consent to that, might have the fact of their making a complaint, some aspect of that complaint being used in some form in litigation. And so those are things to think about when there's a prevalence of consumer complaints, the way that they might be manifested in some enforcement action down the road.
So I would now like to talk a little bit about what we can learn from the consumer complaint database. And as a background, Deloitte took the public portion of the database and analyzed it to try to understand if there were any broader trends that could be observed from that data. We did our analysis primarily on data that ended in the spring, April or so of this year. So some of the slides you'll see are not brought up to current date, but the trend has generally been the same. The first observation that we had was that mortgages have been driving complaint volume. Probably not surprising to most people, but nonetheless, about half of the complaints, at least through spring of 2013, were mortgage complaints. And at least up until that time, the complaint volume for mortgages was actually increasing. It was growing, and mortgage complaints were actually a growing percentage of the total complaint data. So mortgages were truly the driving factor of the complaint data. More recently, as you can see on this chart, in the summer of this year and beyond, complaint volumes on mortgages have started to decrease. So whereas they were 4,000 to 5,000 complaints a month, they've now started to drop closer to 3,000. That's a good trend and obviously part of the improving real estate markets that have been going on, and presumably the cleanup of the troubled mortgages that have started to take hold in the industry. Also, other complaint types have been put into the database, as I mentioned earlier, and therefore mortgages are now a smaller percentage of the total complaint volume activity. But as I mentioned, back in April, mortgage complaints were as high as 63% of the complaint volume. The other products that are part of the complaint database that are significant are credit card and bank account services. They each represent about 14 or 17% of the complaint statistics. So we'll see this data change over time as new products get added and as issues become more or less prevalent in the minds of consumers. Starting in 2013, as I mentioned, debt collection practices have been added, and that complaint volume is picking up significantly. So we expect to see that be a significant component. So the second observation we had was, again, not terribly surprising, that troubled mortgages were really behind the complaint volume for mortgages. And you can see on this stacked bar chart, at least through April of 2013, the dark green shaded area is loan modifications, collections, and foreclosure activity was driving the increasing volume of mortgage complaints. It represented, in fact, about 60% of the complaint activity. So troubled mortgages was what was behind most of the mortgage complaint activity. This presents a number of problems, or at least challenges, to financial institutions that I want to talk about in a little bit, because it's very difficult to resolve some of these kinds of issues. The third observation that we had was that consumer misunderstanding may create more complaints, actually, than errors. Over time, actually, fewer and fewer complaints have been resolved in favor of the consumer, which is an interesting trend. For example, in June of 2012, about 30+% of the complaints were resolved in favor of the consumer, but that had dropped down to 18% by April of 2013. So with more than 80% of the complaints not being resolved in favor of a consumer, that data suggests, anyway, that many complaints might be the result more of consumer misunderstanding or frustration rather than actual mistakes or operational errors by financial institutions. So what does that mean to financial institutions? We think it means that better communication with consumers may help firms manage consumer expectations, as well as help the firms inform themselves about how to improve their processes in order to address future frustrations. In other words, financial institutions should look upon the complaint process as a way to better understand where they may or may not be properly communicating with their customer base and gain insight into whether the customers are experiencing frustration through some process that the bank has in place or through some communication issue that the bank has. It is really an opportunity for financial institutions to take a look inside their own process. In spite of the fact that fewer complaints have been closed with relief, consumers have been disputing fewer and fewer complaints. In aggregate, the resolution percentage that were disputed fell from a peak of almost 28% in January 2012 to about 18% in January 2013. Now, dispute rates have come up a little bit since then, but they're generally in line with these numbers, and they are in line with these numbers for every retail banking product. So at first glance, it might seem odd that they're having fewer disputes, and yet there's less relief being given out. But this trend might show that there's more to keeping consumers satisfied than just giving the consumer relief. Financial institutions may in fact be better communicating more clearly with their customers, and they might be doing a better job understanding and targeting the root cause of complaints, reinforcing this notion that quality communications in complaint dispute situations is really truly important. As I mentioned before, when it comes to mortgage complaints, there are some really unique challenges that banks face because most of these complaints are coming from troubled mortgages. And often little can be done to satisfy the consumer in the circumstances he or she may find themselves. And in fact, only about 15% of mortgage complaints have been resolved in favor of the consumer. In contrast, for example, dispute rates on credit cards and bank accounts get resolved in favor of the consumer twice as frequently as mortgages, over 30%. But even when complaints are resolved in the mortgage borrower's favor, the complainants are still more likely to be unhappy with the result than other products. And that just suggests to us the difficulty of satisfying a consumer. Many of these consumers may want something that simply cannot be given to them, such as complete relief from their mortgage, rescinding the loan, etc. So communication, again, is key when it comes to mortgage customers, and communication is a complex process when it comes to troubled mortgages that companies need to think through very thoroughly. Our next observation was that affluent and established neighborhoods were more likely sources of complaints than other areas. In other words, consumers who live in older and wealthier neighborhoods are more likely to complain. Now, that would probably seem intuitive in the sense that these same neighborhoods are more likely to have more financial products and therefore be more likely to complain. But what we found was that the propensity to complain was true even after we adjusted for this difference in product ownership. So what we did was take mortgages, all mortgages for all areas, and divide the country up into those geographies where there was the highest mortgage concentration, the top 25%. In other words, we looked only at areas that had strong mortgage holdings, mortgage ownership, and then looked for complaint activity within those areas. And the trend held true. That is, the older you were or the wealthier your household income was, the more likely you were to complain. And the graphs on the screen in front of you illustrate this. We looked at complaints by quartile for these areas, and there is a strong trend line so that the youngest aged households complained only about 18 to 20%, and that the wealthiest and older households complained about 30%. That's a percentage of the total complaints, so that these percentages add up to 100. So why is this? Well, the data really doesn't shed an enormous amount of light onto why this may be true. It may be due to greater awareness by these kinds of consumers, or it could be due to other social factors. Certainly, we're still looking at educated and fairly well-off people who are living in these areas. But the other thing that we observed out of this data is that looking at complaint data in aggregate may not always be an accurate barometer of issues. And in particular, it may not represent certain customers who are particularly of concern to the CFPB, namely those who are underbanked or lower socioeconomic segments, the younger population, the military, etc. These people apparently tend to complain less frequently than other segments. And therefore, if you're looking at your own complaint data and looking at the numbers in aggregate or even slicing and dicing the numbers, you may miss the fact that you have someone who is really vitally important in your customer base who has not, for one reason or another, voiced their complaint. And therefore, it behooves all financial institutions to look very carefully through their data and look in particular at those complaints that they think represent people of special interest and special classes that are of particular concern. The last observation we had when looking at the data was that companies are actually getting better at responding to consumer complaints. The consumer complaint database may be actually helping companies learn how to better respond to consumers, certainly with respect to the timeliness of their response. So, for example, in December 2011, almost 10% of responses were untimely. But by April of 2013, that percentage had dropped down to around 1%. Companies are getting it. They're starting to understand how to respond to customers' complaints in a timely manner. They're being able to respond to customers with answers that seem to be satisfying, or at least more satisfying to customers, as evidenced by the drop in dispute rates. We also looked at whether there was an advantage or disadvantage to being a big institution, medium, or small institution. And generally what we found was that the size doesn't affect companies' consumer complaints. So you see the tall bars there is the percentage of disputed complaints by size of institutions. So we looked at the largest companies in the complaint database, that is the top 6 companies that had 5,000 complaints, then the next 51 companies that had 1,000 to 5,000 complaints, and then the smallest companies with the smallest number of complaints, less than 100. And all of them had about the same dispute rate, suggesting that the size of the institution, or at least the number of complaints, didn't affect your ability to satisfy the customer. The one difference was that when it came to timeliness, somewhat surprisingly, the smallest institutions, those that had the least number of complaints, were the most untimely in their response. And this is a little bit of surprise because if a company has very few complaints, you would think that they would be able to respond quite timely. It's the larger institutions where they may be flooded with complaints that have a greater difficulty in responding quickly. But in fact, the biggest institutions have put in place fairly sophisticated complaint management systems, whereas small institutions, by and large, have used somewhat manual processes, and therefore they may be disadvantaged slightly in terms of how they deal with complaints. So, what can we say about the complaint process, and what can companies do with respect to complaints? Allison referred to a number of practices that the examination manual looks for, and this list in front of you talks about some of the leading practices that companies should have with respect to complaints. First and foremost, it is critical to have a written policy and procedures and process that covers complaints. And those policies should define the complaint. That is, they should explain what is a complaint. It should not just necessarily be any interaction with a customer, but when does an interaction with a customer represent a true complaint or represents instead a dialogue with the customer as through a customer representative center, for example. And that's really actually a pretty challenging issue, because if you have a call center, for example, and the customer calls up and says, I'm unhappy about this charge on my credit card, is that a complaint? Or is that just an inquiry by the customer in due course? So companies need to be very thoughtful about defining what they constitute complaints and have clear definitions that everybody can understand. Many of the larger institutions also have complaints taken by business areas. So for example, the mortgage area would handle complaints completely separate from the credit card area, because they have a different call center, because they have different systems. And so consistency across business areas and business lines and roles and responsibilities is truly critical. Otherwise, you have an instance where one business area is defining, for example, complaint very differently than another business area. And in sort of the worst case scenario, somebody calls up and says, I'm going active duty, by example, and he calls up the credit card division and says, I'm going active duty, and somehow that does not get communicated to other business areas, for example, the mortgage area. And therefore, the mortgage area is unaware that the individual, the borrower, is now protected. Companies also need to know how to categorize complaints, and so that they can catalog and respond to them. So how should you define a complaint, and how should you catalog it?
And one part that I would add to what Dennis is saying is that you want to be able to categorize complaints. You want that categorization to be consistent across business lines, as he said. And this really also goes in tandem with how you think about what a complaint is, and in thinking about what a complaint is, how that complaint gets responded to and escalated, if you will, up the chain. And so part of the thinking about how you define a complaint, how you categorize a complaint, and how you maintain that consistency is also how do you escalate that complaint when it comes in, and make sure that the people or unit that needs to respond to it does so in an appropriate manner and in a timely manner.
Another issue that is obviously quite important is response times. Now, it's very easy to say, you will respond to the customer's complaint within 15 days as required, but what does that actually mean? Does that mean you'll resolve the complaint at that point in time, which might be impossible in the case of something fairly complicated that requires a great deal of research? Or does it mean that you just acknowledge receipt of the complaint, which is probably not terribly satisfying to the customer? So companies need to really think through the different kinds of complaints they're going to get and are getting, and what is reasonable response times by complaint, and how do they measure that. If it's logged somewhere so that they can track it. If it's a telephone conversation, how will that be recorded? All of these kinds of operational issues really need to be thought through and memorialized in policies and procedures and put in place in a consistent practice.
Another issue that is crucial and that the CFPB considers in both its examination process but also more generally is what kind of employee training a company has in place when it comes to handling the intake and response to consumer complaints. And it's important that there not only be a method for handling intake, for defining complaints, for categorizing them, for appropriately escalating them, but that all of these processes be memorialized in a fashion so that they can be used in a training module that's provided to all all folks who would interface in the consumer complaint arena in a particular company, in a particular business line within a company. And the training aspect of that is crucial. And if you go and you look at, for example, what the CFPB looks at when it examines a bank or non-bank over which it has supervisory authority, the training components are crucial. And the way that an entity goes about training its employees to handle consumer complaints is very significant and considered to be a very important part of how the CFPB determines the relative seriousness with which an institution approaches its handling of consumer complaints.
Aggregation of complaint data so that an institution can understand holistically what kinds of complaints it's receiving and what it's doing with respect to those complaints is obviously a critical piece of any complaint management process. So this becomes a challenge for financial institutions sometimes in the sense of how do you do that, particularly with respect to systems that you put in place. Sophisticated large financial institutions may have very complicated complaint management systems in place which do all kinds of things, including not only capture complaints by consumers but actually proactively monitor social media, for example, for potential issues, tone of voice in the interaction with call centers. There are many sophisticated analytical tools that can be built into the complaint management monitoring process. But for the smaller financial institutions, frankly, it may come down to a spreadsheet. And while I don't recommend any particular complaint management tool or methodology, I would caution companies to be very cognizant of the limitations of spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are very easy to use and also very easy to have errors on. There's no audit trail in a spreadsheet. There is limited version control over a spreadsheet, and they are easily erased or errors get entered. In other words, there's very little in the way of controls over a spreadsheet. So while it may make sense for your institution, because you only have a few complaints a year, for example, to use a spreadsheet, just be thoughtful about whether that's the tool that would be the best tool for you, because they do contain some inherent risks.
One other thing I would add in the realm of monitoring complaints is, in particular, the CFPB is especially interested, not only interested, but especially interested in complaints that allege unfair, deceptive, and/or abusive practices, or otherwise allege some kind of unfair treatment, either in the fair lending context or just more generally. And so these are what would you call UDAP, unfair, deceptive, and/or abusive acts and practices. Those particular types of complaints are particularly the CFPB is particularly sensitive to that category of complaint and notes in its examination manual, for example, that that's a category of complaints that it looks to make sure an institution has specifically designated. And so I would note that in addition to having a method in place for monitoring and tracking complaints, you also want to have a method in place for actually identifying particular types of complaints, especially those that fit within these particular categories.
That's a great point, Allison. And again, a challenge for companies in terms of identifying which customers they're going to flag as potentially relevant for UDAP type of issues. A challenge for every institution, but an important challenge to try to meet. Obviously, companies need to continue to monitor their complaint process on an ongoing basis. And lastly, or second to lastly, there needs to be a formalized process by which board, management, and the regulators can be informed around consumer complaints. Keep in mind that the complaints that find their way over to the CFPB are probably only a percentage of the total complaints that any institution receives. Many customers will just complain directly to the institution without necessarily going through the regulator. But those are equally important and need to be included in your complaint process, obviously, and reported accordingly so that they are recognized for the importance that they are. The board should be informed on a regular basis about complaints. There needs to be a process to summarize them and elevate them up to the board so that they can understand these issues on a timely basis. And then institutions need to put in place a process to independently test their program. They can hire outside consultants or attorneys. They can use their internal audit function to do this. They can use their compliance function to use this. But they need to take someone outside of the complaint process who will independently test the efficacy, reliability, and timeliness of the complaint management system.
One other thing that companies that are regulated by the CFPB should keep in mind is when they get a consumer complaint, either through the CFPB's consumer complaint portal or just independently a consumer complains, is that consumer complaining about a specific practice or act that the company itself engaged in, or is it a specific act or practice that one of the company's service providers or vendors engaged in? And this is an important distinction. The CFPB expects that companies manage their vendors and actually puts a real premium on that management process and looks at that management process in great detail in any audit or examination that the CFPB undertakes. But it's important for a company to know the source of the complaint. So for example, if a company is looking at and trying to understand the trends that it's seeing in particular practices, are those practices a result of an outside vendor, or are those practices the result of a particular type of conduct going on within the company itself? And those are also categories of complaints and ways to address complaints that the CFPB is particularly keen on making sure companies put into their compliance management systems.
It's a great point, Allison, and companies can use this really to their advantage when they're entering into agreements with these service providers, because you can build these kinds of things into your service level agreement with the third party provider and make them responsible. Ultimately, of course, though, the financial institution is responsible for all the actions, including actions of third party providers, even if they have delegated control and responsibility out. So that's our program.
So that's our program today, but we are now opening up our lines for questions, and you can type in your question and we will answer any of the questions that we receive. I see there's one question from somebody who's listening that asks who the CFPB regulates. The CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, regulates two categories of financial institutions. it has supervisory and enforcement authority over any bank that has more than $10 billion in assets, and that's any bank or any bank affiliate that has more than $10 billion in assets. And so what that means is that an affiliate is any company or institution that shares ownership control with another one. So it's a bank that has more than $10 billion in assets in any of that bank's affiliates. The other category over which the CFPB, other category financial institutions over which the CFPB has jurisdiction are non-banks, and specifically non-banks that offer or provide a consumer financial service or product. The CFPB has enforcement jurisdiction over any of those non-banks, and it has supervisory authority over that category of non-banks if that category of non-banks includes any provider of mortgages, any provider of student loans, private student loans, or payday loans. In addition, the CFPB has issued what's called larger participant rulemakings, which are essentially rules that the CFPB promulgates that describe the way that it is going to regulate a sector of the marketplace. For example, debt collection is debt collectors that comprise the largest part of that market are subject to the CFPB supervisory authority. Just the other day, the CFPB issued a larger participant rulemaking for institutions that service student loans. Those are also non-banks that are subject to the CFPB supervisory authority. So those are the categories of financial institutions over which the CFPB has supervisory and enforcement authority, to answer one of the questions we've received.
Allison, there are a number of industries that seem to kind of fall somewhere in between what is a consumer financial institution and non-consumer financial institution. And I'm thinking, for example, of the rent-to-own business. Has the CFPB made any announcements about whether they view that as part of their, under their purview, or is that yet to be announced?
So I haven't seen any public announcements about anything concerning that particular industry, but the CFPB has jurisdiction over what's called specifically a covered person. So I've described basically a covered person being a bank with more than $10 billion in assets, or a non-bank that offers or provides a consumer financial product or service. There are aspects of the rent-to-own business, as I understand it, that would seem to fall within the definition of providing a consumer financial good or service that could take such an institution into the jurisdiction of the CFPB. Certainly, if you kind of conceptualize the CFPB's jurisdiction as being enforcement authority and supervisory authority, enforcement authority would be over any non-bank that offers or provides a consumer financial good or service. Supervisory authority is a little bit more cabined than that. So I think there certainly could be an argument that that sector of the financial services economy could fall within the CFPB's jurisdiction, enforcement jurisdiction at some point. I see we have a few more questions. One question, does the CFPB perceive cases that are closed with financial relief as indicators of wrongdoing? I'm not sure I understand exactly what that question is asking, but I will attempt to answer it. The idea that a complaint, that a company has handled a consumer complaint and provided some kind of financial relief to that consumer, I think that's the question. Does the CFPB believe that that is per se proof that that company engaged in wrongdoing? I wouldn't assume that. I wouldn't assume that the CFPB is going to say, well, you paid X number of dollars to this number of consumers who made a complaint, thus that practice might have been a bad practice, and we're going to look at that practice and pursue it. I wouldn't make that assumption. The CFPB might look at that as an indicator of possible wrongdoing. I don't think it would say it would never look at that fact, but I couldn't see a scenario in which that set of facts alone would drive a decision to, say, pursue an enforcement action. I hope that that's the question that this particular person was asking. See, we have another question. Is there any further data available other than the columns presented publicly? For example, more specific categorical data that helps drill down the complaints?
Well, the data that's available publicly is the only data that is available. Don't mean to be flip in my answer. There are many categories of information that are presented. including sub-product, for example, the name of the institution, the day the complaint was received, the day the complaint was resolved, etc. However, I will say it is not a hugely robust set of information, the data fields that are provided publicly. CFPB keeps confidential many aspects of an individual complaint and does not publicly release that information.
Another question is, you mentioned that it is important to define what a complaint is. Do you have suggestions on where to look to help determine how to assemble that kind of definition? You know, I think that this is a tricky issue, because I think if you asked 50 companies, they would probably have 50 slightly different definitions of what a complaint is. And in part, what the definition of a complaint is drives the process for responding to complaints, but it's a little bit of a circular answer there. But I guess what I would say is a complaint is any instance when a consumer expresses not a query or an inquiry, but actually expresses dissatisfaction with a product or service that they received. And I'll let Dennis talk a little bit about, you know, the format in which you might see that, or if he has, you know, any embellishment to that definition.
Well, I think that's a great definition, Allison, at least for a start, but I agree that this is truly a challenging thing for institutions. So I would distinguish someone who is making an inquiry over a product or service that they have. I've got a question about a charge I received on my financial statement, my monthly statement. That I would view personally anyway, and I'm speaking personally, as an inquiry. However, at the end of that process, if the customer expresses frustration or dissatisfaction with the response received, I think you've certainly edged into something that's closer to a complaint at that point. So to me, what this tells me is that you need to have a lot of training with the people that are interacting with the customer so that they can understand how to define when the customer is now entered into a complaint. I mean, the customer may or may not say, I'm lodging a complaint. They may say, I've never had such bad treatment by my financial institution before. I can't believe you treat people like this. That's a complaint, at least in my mind anyway. So that's when very sophisticated institutions actually use tone of voice recognition software and other kinds of things. But barring that, you're going to have to put in place some guidelines that allow the people that are really on the front lines to recognize when something is a complaint.
Another question we've received, I've found that it's difficult to create a good list of primary issues raised in complaints that works for both deposit and lending products. Do you have any recommendations regarding the development of this list?
Yeah, so I haven't thought too much about that, but I think you probably are going to have separate lists. I think that the kinds of issues being raised around depository type of products is going to be different than the kinds of questions being raised around loan products, for example. However, there might be some commonalities, for example, frustration around lack of clarity in the response, frustration around, poor communication with the consumer at the outset. So I got a statement, whether it's a bank statement, a deposit statement, or a mortgage statement, and I can't understand why I'm being charged for the following item, and it's not clear from the statement that I received. I think that would be the kind of example that would sort of cross both products. I don't have a good list in response specifically to your question. I don't have something I can point you to. I think these are probably evolving kinds of processes, and that the list probably is going to be expanding over time as new issues arise and come to your attention.
Another question, is a company's profile improved with the CFPB if that company provides a quicker response than the required 15 and 60 days? I would say yes and possibly no. It certainly doesn't hurt to provide a response in a more timely fashion than that which is required or expected. It doesn't, however, mean that just because a company provides a quicker response that quickness alone is going to increase that company's or enhance that company's profile, if you will, with the CFPB. Obviously, if the number of complaints is substantial and the practices alleged are fairly egregious in the eyes of the CFPB, then the time for responding to complaints isn't really going to do much to mitigate those facts. But certainly it doesn't hurt to have a quick timeline for responding, and it certainly is something that the CFPB looks at both in its examination and, of course, if there's ever an enforcement matter, it also considers that fact as well, how timely a company responds to consumer complaints, because that timeliness is often viewed, at least in part, as a proxy for how serious the company takes consumer complaints and how much effort and how many resources it addresses and puts toward responding to those complaints. So I guess I would answer that question by saying yes, but with a caveat that not always going to be the case, but it certainly doesn't hurt.
Allison, I guess if it was always just timeliness, a company could just say, deny everybody very quickly, and they could quickly have a great response rate.
That's right. So it's obviously more than that, but certainly timeliness matters. You certainly don't want to be seen as being outside of the generally expected 15 and 60-day response times, at least not on a consistent basis. Another question we have is, once a bank has responded to a CFPB complaint and the consumer responds back, do we get to see the consumer's response to us?
No, I don't believe you do.
I don't believe you do. Another question we have is, how are the banks doing with getting their complaint processes established and documented, and what kinds of penalties or repercussions are we aware of thus far? Do the banks outsource aspects of their building of this capacity, and can you distinguish by large and small institutions? And I think Dennis touched on some of that earlier.
Well, it's a great question, and unfortunately not an easy answer, because it really depends on the institution and in particular where institutions are vesting the authority to deal with complaints. So some institutions push this into their compliance area or the product area. Other institutions view it more in the way of customer relationships, and so the customer relation area is sort of responsible. And the biggest institutions probably have all of these kinds of functions weighing in and involved. Companies are outsourcing at least portions of this to companies, to providers. It's not possible to outsource everything, but you can certainly buy systems and tools, for example, from outside vendors and suppliers. You can also, obviously, if you outsource your servicing to a third party, you would be probably outsourcing the complaint management aspect of that servicing to the service provider, to the servicer. Therefore, you would need to really understand, if you have a mortgage servicer who's doing your third-party servicing for you, what is their complaint process, and does it adhere to what you expect it to adhere? Once again, we get back to the point that Allison raised, importantly, about third parties.
Thank you. If I could add to that. So in April of 2012, the CFPB issued a bulletin advising the banks and non-banks that it regulates that the CFPB considers the vendor management to be a crucial part of how banks and non-banks do business, and that it's not enough for an entity to say, well, that's how my vendor does it, that's not how I do it, so I can't be held accountable for what that vendor does. So to Dennis's point, if you do outsource the management or handling of consumer complaints, it's still the case that the CFPB will expect that institution control and oversee and have a real understanding of what its vendors are doing in that vein. And someone asked earlier at the beginning of our question and answer period what the CFPB regulates. The CFPB, I should add, also oversees and has the ability to regulate the service providers for non-bank institutions. So if a service provider is involved in providing a service to a non-bank and that non-bank is the subject of an enforcement action, that service provider could also be the subject of an enforcement action. And at the very least, the CFPB is going to look closely at the way that that non-bank, for example, or bank, handles its vendor relationships. And that handling of that relationship is a big part of what the CFPB considers, both in the supervisory context and also in the enforcement context. So we have another question. If a customer disputes a bank's resolution of a complaint, is there follow-up by the CFPB or other regulators? There can be follow-up. It's not a given that there would be follow-up. I think it's really on a case-by-case basis. If an entity is consistently disputing its customers' complaints and not resolving its customer complaints in a manner that the CFPB or many consumers deem unsatisfactory, in a manner that they deem unsatisfactory, then that might be something unto itself that the CFPB would look at further. But it's not the case that in one isolated instance, for example, that would necessarily spur the CFPB to get involved or otherwise refer that complaint to another regulator. It's really going to be looking more at the aggregate responses and at the particular practices or conduct that's alleged by the consumer in the consumer complaint.
Right.
We have another question. What is considered to be a timely response? For an example, if there's an extension given to respond to resolve, might that be given? If an issue is more complex, might there be more time to respond? I think that's what the question is. And yes, the CFPB has a rule that generally there's a 15-day and 60-day period for responding, but obviously particular issues, for example, the ones that Dennis described in the mortgage arena, are often more complex, and the CFPB is, and I have seen this having worked there, often inclined to provide more time to respond and to understand more about the particular complexities of a particular issue. And so the hard and fast rule of 15 days and 60 days is always subject to some exception.
Right.
Have you seen banks, another question we have is, have you seen banks trying to protect some of the complaint issues and discussions with attorney-client privilege, and if so, how are they doing this? I don't know if you've seen that, Dennis. I have not seen that.
I don't have any experience with that, no.
I haven't seen that either. I think that if some institution claimed attorney-client privilege, it would be kind of an unusual posture for it to be in, because its engagement with a consumer would seem to suggest that, the fact that it's engaging with a consumer, that engagement at least would not most likely be protected by attorney-client privilege. Perhaps internal conversations might be, but I haven't seen that happen, and I don't believe Dennis has either. But I guess in theory, at some point, you could see a scenario where someone might claim some aspect of the consumer complaint response process is protected by that privilege, but
I guess I could envision a scenario where it escalates into litigation,
right,
where that would certainly be the case. But and I'm not a lawyer, but I just have a hard time envisioning it being a protected kind of issue.
Yeah, it seems a somewhat remote possibility to me as well. I think we have time for one or two more questions. One other question we have is, what is the CFPB doing when it sends a recontact for more information, even though the consumer hasn't disputed the response? To answer this person's question, sometimes the CFPB, as I understand it, is trying to get more information about a particular practice, or perhaps trying to understand the nature of the complaint or the alleged practice being complained about. It might be the case that one complaint isn't just one complaint, but it's many complaints that they're receiving about a particular practice, and they're trying to get a better understanding of that. Or perhaps they're trying to get a better understanding of the actual response process in place at that particular institution. And I don't know if Dennis has anything else he wants to add to that.
No, I think that's really complete, Allison.
Well, I think that that's about it for our program this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And you can access these materials on the Venable website, which is www.venable.com, Venable. And the PowerPoint presentation that Dennis and I presented today will be available along with a recording of this presentation as well. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. We've enjoyed it.
Thank you.